I don't know really where you want me to start talking about Women's Aid, because
Well,
there's so many odds and ends.
When you want to say the nicest things in the nicest way, give her roses. Cadbury's Roses Chocolates.
And that's when we moved in, and there was nobody living here in this area. We were the first house to be opened by Norman Vaughan, who was a old comedian who used to advertise Cadbury's Roses chocolates by being on television going, "Roses grow on you," and a rose would come out of his thumb. And he planted a rose bush in our garden. Development Corporation arranged all this, I suppose.
I'd love to know what you did when you started,
Right, okay.
but first I'd love to know why you did it.
Right.
Was there something that happened? Did you meet somebody?
No. I'd been aware from childhood that some people got beaten up because my mother used to hide a lady from up the street in the pantry, and her husband would come and Mum would lie and say, "No, she's not here, haven't seen her."
Wow.
So I knew that there was trouble out there, but I was a lucky child. Well, then when we moved here, that was just somewhere in the background. But all the arrivals workers, as they went round, would report back into the corporation where they thought help might be needed. And it was things like people feeling isolated, and because everyone was in new, and there was a lot of pressure on people, self-inflicted pressure, to feel they had to have a load of stuff. And the only way to get respect or friendship was to have stuff. And perhaps partly as a result of that, but perhaps partly it has always been part of life and not sufficiently recognised, we were beginning to have people come to us in the corporation saying, we knew they were in trouble. And this information was fed by the arrivals workers and the community workers higher up. And it was agreed that we should try to establish a women's aid refuge. And the reason for that was that people who needed to leave their house because they were at risk, and their children often were at risk too, had nowhere to go. They'd go to DHSS, the Department of Health and Social Security, saying they left home, violence, and they would say, "Oh yes, well we can, fund that. Where your rent, where are you going to be?" But they didn't have anywhere to go, so they didn't have an address, and so it was catch-22 situation. In order to get your money, you've got to go back to where you've got an address, which is the home you've just run away from.
Yeah.
But once there was an address, they were safe. And by the time we were looking at it, Erin Pitsey had already started up the first, I think, Women's Aid Refuge in London, in Chiswick. We were assigned by the Development Corporation, who were huge support, to try to get a Women's Aid group established. And so we went out and we talked to all kinds of groups. They might be the Rotary Club, the Women's Institutes, the various churches, the CAB workers. So many different groups of people. And we told them about this problem, this catch-22 situation. And almost all of them responded partly with incredulity, but with sympathy, and offered some help. One or two didn't. We had one where a man said, "Oh no, we know," and I think he was a doctor, "No, women like it."
Wow.
And that my reply, well, they wouldn't come to us if they like it. It's the ones who don't like it come to us. And on the one occasion I was 35 years old, 36, 37 years old, with an an early teenager and 1-2 years younger of my own, happily married, and I was doing a bit of role play with Terry about what it's like to be somebody in this situation, trying to get money to be able to leave it. Bit of role play. And this chap, he just really wanted me to be a blue stocking or a woman out for what she could get.
Mm.
And I found that quite insulting, but most people weren't like that at all. You know, they were able to accept I was just a mum with 2 kids who wanted to help.
Mm.
And so Terry and I went round and talked to lots of groups in different ways. I did some on my own, and say he did some with me. And gradually we established a group of about 20. And we said, right, now the first thing we could do is get a refuge. Well, now, of course, we've changed to something else. We now have to work with the authorities to get a building. Corporation were very good. But before we had a refuge, we had our first person come to us for help.
Wow.
And she came via a man who was then the editor of the old Milton Keynes Gazette. So I think that's what it was called. Or Bletchley Gazette, it might even have been. And he was a marriage guidance counsellor. And he got in touch with us about this woman with 4 children and a dog, who was in big trouble and had to get out of where she was. She fled the house and she'd gone to her parents' house. But it was in the same area, and the man, of course, knew where she was.
Sure.
So she was also putting her parents at risk now. So we had nowhere to put her. So I came home and told Roger of the problem, and as I said, I've got a marvellous marriage and a lovely husband. So lucky. So lucky. And I said, could we possibly have them here for a while until there's somewhere she can go? And there were 4 children and we'd got 2, and he said, well, do you think we could cope? I said, oh yes, I could cope. So he said, right, oh, go ahead. And then as an afterthought, I said, oh, and they've got a dog. So he said, oh, what sort of a dog? So I said, it's a little dog. He said, is it male or female? And I said, it's a bitch. He said, oh, that's all right, because we had a male dog. So they all came in, and they were with us for a few weeks. And she was the most amazing woman. And later on, she was the first woman we were able to pay, to employ, to work in the refuge, which we then had.
Is that right?
And she solved situations and she developed a confidence. It was wonderful to see.
Wow.
Anyway, so that was the start. Then we eventually got this house from the Development Corporation, peppercorn rent, and they were sympathetic to any repairs needed doing, big old farmhouse. And they had 6 bedrooms and 2 big rooms downstairs, and one was the kitchen, one was the living room, and then there were a couple of little rooms upstairs that you couldn't inhabit because of fire risks, we were told, so it was just an office. And a little garden. And a social worker at a meeting had said, yes, they knew there was domestic violence, but it was daft to set up a refuge because, well, it'd be full in no time.
Is that right?
We got this house and, yes, it was. They were right in social services. We had 2 families to a bedroom in no time at all. Well, into the big bedrooms. But it was doing well, and then we were able to, as a group, we were then volunteers on call. Always, middle of the night, Samaritans phone up, police phone up, and we'd go down. And my husband was marvellous. He would look after our 2, and later on he and other men, husbands of other men and other women, not other men in those days. They would come down and help if there was a problem with the plumbing that we then didn't know how to deal with.
Oh, yeah.
They were good as gold, but we would go down to welcome the women in, as the police brought them in or whatever.
So as I listen to you now, I think that's an amazing and massive thing that you're doing. At the time, does it feel daunting, or does it just feel...
No. Well, I was up for the challenge. I was in my 30s. I had a family. I could imagine how these women must feel and how the children, only imagine. And so, no, there was this team of people about me, and the corporation was supportive. You know, they were. I was being employed in part to do this. Later on, when everything was established, they withdrew that, but I just carried on because it mattered to me. You know, the place was kept pretty secure. The chap who was head of the local newspaper, the editor, and also the marriage guidance, he was on our side, and he kept the place private, you know, so that was secure. But over time, taxi drivers would drop women off, or people would talk.
Right.
And so a few people began to know where we were. And one woman had come in, and she had her children with her. And he wanted to get at her, and of course they used to phone, if they could get the phone number, they'd phone up and harangue the women, you know, there, and we had a whistle by the phone as far as I can remember. But this chap was so frustrated at not being able to get to his family, he angled his car across the road and drove straight through the front door. Children used to play in that hallway, trains and buses and all the rest of it. So they could have been killed. Anyway, that left us with a building job, but, you know, obviously we had to look after the children in our own homes for a while because the place wasn't secure.
And you've moved from rescuing people to the complexity of their issues are now suddenly...
Yes, and getting them rehoused.
Rehousing and dealing with partners turning up unannounced in a car, or psychological damage of children and pain that causes them to do things.
Yes.
That must have been a steep learning curve.
Yes, because most of us had no experience of it. The main thing was to get the women to have the money they were entitled to get housing for them, and to equip the housing. And then I moved away because I carried on for a year or so after I lost my daughter. I can tell you a lovely experience there. My daughter had been dead for about a month, and I'm giving myself a good talking to. Come on, get out there. There's nothing you can do about it. Get out there. Help someone who can be helped a bit. And I went into the refuge that day, and I went out to the kitchen, this big square kitchen, which was very steamy, with cooking smells and washing on and all the rest of it. And there was a white woman making up a black woman with white women's makeup, and they were sacks about it. They thought it was hilarious. It was lovely. And a big Italian woman who was with us, her husband had been awful, and she had quite a few children. He was taking them off to Italy or something, you know, all kinds of things. But there was a baker's strike on, or a shortage of flour. And people didn't know how to make their own bread anymore. And she did. And she got these good old baker's arms, and she was showing them how to knead the dough. And when I came away, I can remember thinking, well, you went in there to help them, you did nothing. But I was so helped. You know, we didn't talk about my daughter, but just being in that atmosphere of people trying to help each other. It was wonderful.
Wow.
Yeah.
Carol, tell me, now looking back on all of this, how do you feel with MK Act as it is now and this organisation?
I feel, when I went and saw what they are now doing, and the number of people involved, and despite the size of it, they haven't lost that personal touch. It hasn't become what I'd call a traditional institution. It's still a personal, caring organisation. And I was shown around the wonderful things they'd done and the progress that had been made. And as each person has come in and led it in a different way, they've brought a new talent to it. And so my feeling was one of great pride, to be honest, that I had been at the beginning of this, but also great humility, because I could never have taken it there. There were these other people who had just carried the baton and had gone further and further, and it was secure. I think sometimes in life there's, as I said to you earlier, you happen to be the right person at the right time in history. And that is sheer good fortune. But then to have been there at the right time in history and come across other people who in turn came across others who could develop everything and still keep a near perfection, I think is wonderful.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, listen, on behalf of people watching and listening, I guess I just want to say thank you for having the courage to invite people into your house. And you started this by describing a little girl who helped her mum hide people under the stairs, and that thread has carried through your life, and to protect people and to welcome people in and to include people. And
oh, bless you.
So thank you so much.
I'm going to tell you one more thing. I know you finished the programme. But when I went to the Women's Aid Refuge, the new one, when Camilla Parker Bowles came and and recognised her.
She told me she got to meet you.
Well, she was... I hadn't expected that I would feel any esteem for her, but she was genuine. And that was a lesson to me.
Yeah.
What's your prejudices? But the loveliest thing that happened to me that day was one of the women, who I think is a volunteer there, came and handed me an envelope, and she said the contents were from her husband. I said, why is this? She said he was a child in the refuge when you were there in the early days. No. Middle-aged man now.
Wow.
And he wanted to say a thank you. And he sent me a draft of some comments I'd made 20 years ago nearly. And the fact that he remembered it with gladness, was that to me meant more than anything.
Yeah.
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 It was lovely. So I don't know how much you can pay me for this.